There is a message sitting in your drafts right now, or maybe you already sent it. A long message, longer than it needed to be, explaining yourself to someone who had already made up their mind about you, justifying a decision they didn't ask you to justify, defending yourself against something they implied, trying with words and patience and the careful architecture of your sentences to fix the image of you that exists in someone else's head. And at the end of it, after you pressed send and the response came back, did it work? Did they finally understand you the way you needed to be understood? Or did you feel something else, a kind of exhaustion, a sense that you had spent something real on something that didn't deserve it, that the very act of explaining had somehow made you smaller? This episode is about that feeling, about what it means, where it comes from, and what the Stoics understood. With unusual clarity, 2,000 years before smartphones made the compulsion to respond into an architecture of daily life, about the hidden cost of needing to be understood. It is about the people who disappear, who go quiet, who withdraw from the noise not in defeat, but in something that looks from the outside almost like indifference, and is from the inside the most deliberate and most difficult choice a person can make. But this episode will not romanticize the silence, because silence has many forms, and not all of them are strength. Some are fear, some are punishment, some are wounds wearing the clothes of wisdom. And if you cannot tell the difference in yourself, honestly, in the specific moment when silence is available to you, then the philosophy offers you nothing except a more sophisticated-sounding excuse. So this is a journey, not just into silence, but into the question of which silence you are actually practicing. And that distinction, it turns out, changes everything. Let's start with the trap, because until you can see it clearly, not as an abstract concept, but as the specific mechanism operating in your own life right now, you cannot begin to get out of it. You are in a conversation. Someone says something, casually, maybe not even directly at you, and it lands on something you care about, your competence, your character, your intentions. And before you have made any conscious decision to respond, your mind is already building the case, assembling evidence, rehearsing the sentence that will set the record straight. Or you read a message from someone who has drawn a conclusion about you that is wrong, maybe only slightly wrong, maybe deeply wrong, and the wrongness of it feels intolerable, not because any real consequence hangs on whether they understand you correctly, but because somewhere in you the wrong impression feels like a threat. This is the trap. And most people spend their entire lives inside it, without ever asking the one question that would free them. What exactly is being threatened? Epictetus drew the most important line in the Enchiridion right at the beginning, the line between what is ours and what is not. What is ours? Our choices, our intentions, our values, our responses, our effort. What is not ours? What other people think, what they conclude, what story they construct about us based on the evidence they have. The image of you that lives in someone else's mind is not yours. It never was. You contributed raw material that they shaped according to their own history, their own fears, their own unexamined assumptions. You did not build it. You cannot control it. And every effort to manage it, every explanation, every defense, every careful message designed to repair the impression, is energy spent on something that was never in your hands, and yet you treat it like yours. You spend real time, real emotional resources, real portions of a life that is happening right now trying to curate it, to make sure that the version of you in other people's heads is accurate, favorable, not wrong, in the ways that feel most dangerous. Marcus Aurelius returned to this problem throughout the Meditations, asking himself again and again why a person would allow their peace to be disturbed by another's judgment. He kept arriving at the same answer, because they had not yet separated their identity from their reputation, because they were still treating the image, fragile, incomplete, never quite accurate, as if it were the self. The trap is not that people misunderstand you. They will, always in small ways and large ones, and no amount of explanation will fully close that gap. The trap is that you have begun to need them not to, and that need, quiet, constant, invisible, is what keeps you explaining, what keeps you responding, what keeps you giving away the only thing that was ever actually yours, your attention. But here is what I want you to sit with before we go further. The trap does not feel like a trap. It feels like integrity. It feels like the reasonable desire to be seen accurately, and that is what makes it so difficult to name, and so important to name precisely. There is a particular kind of person who is always in the conversation, always responding, always present in every argument, every thread, every moment where something needs to be said or clarified or defended, and they look strong. From the outside, the person who never lets a slight pass without acknowledgement, who is perpetually vocal, perpetually visible, looks like someone whose presence cannot be ignored, someone who refuses to be overlooked. But look more carefully, because when the Stoics examined this behavior honestly, what they found underneath the volume was not strength. It was something much more fragile. Every reaction is a movement. Every defensive response to a provocation is, at its root, evidence that the provocation found its target. The person who responds to everything is, in the most precise sense, controlled by everything. Their interior state is not their own. It belongs to whoever spoke last. Think about the last time you sent a message you regretted. Not because it was cruel, because it was too much, too long, too earnest, too exposed. You gave someone access to exactly how much their opinion mattered to you, and the moment you pressed send, you felt it, that specific vulnerability, that small, precise regret of having shown your hand to someone who didn't deserve to see it. That feeling is not accidental, it is accurate. It is your clearest instinct telling you that something real was spent on something that didn't earn it. Seneca wrote in his letters to Lucilius that true power has one source. Most powerful is he who has himself in his own power, not power over circumstances, not power over other people's behavior or conclusions or impressions. Power over himself, over where he directs his attention, how he responds to what arrives, whether he can be moved from his center by what comes at him from outside. The person who is always loud is not speaking from that kind of power. They are speaking from its absence, from the fear that if they go quiet, the wrong version of them will win. That silence will be read as admission, that the image, fragile, incomplete, perpetually at risk, will be damaged beyond repair if they stop defending it. And the person who has learned to go quiet? They have made a different calculation. They have asked, what exactly am I protecting when I respond? And they have found honestly that the answer is not themselves. It is a story about themselves. And a story, however carefully tended, is not the same thing as a self. Which brings us to the moment where everything actually happens, a moment so small it is almost invisible, and so important it contains everything we are building toward. There is a moment. Hold it in your mind, because the rest of this episode depends on understanding it precisely. Someone says something, in person, in a message, in a comment, something that lands with that specific weight, the weight of something that found the place in you that is still uncertain, still tender, still not quite settled about itself. And in the fraction of a second after it lands, before the response forms, before the heat rises, before the machinery of self-defense activates, there is a space. It is very small, easily missed. Most people have never noticed it because they have never needed to look for it. The response comes so quickly, so automatically, trained by years of operating in a world that treats reaction as engagement and silence as absence, that the space appears and closes and is gone before you knew it was there. But it is there, and in that space lives your actual freedom. Epictetus described this at the very heart of the Enchiridion. The impression arrives without your permission. You cannot control what enters your awareness. What you have control over is what happens next. Whether you give your assent to the impression, whether you let it become your emergency, your evidence, your reason to speak. The practice, and it is a practice, something you do badly many times before you do it with any ease, is to find that space, to stay in it long enough to ask one question, genuinely and without pretense: is this a threat to anything real, or is it a threat to the image, the managed, curated image, that I have confused with myself? And if it is only the image, if the thing that was said cannot actually touch what you value, cannot alter what you know to be true about your intentions and your choices, then in that moment you are free. Free to respond or not respond. Free to speak or to be silent. Free to choose what the moment actually needs, rather than what your anxiety is demanding. That freedom does not announce itself. It arrives quietly in the form of a response that doesn't come, a message that stays in the drafts, a conversation that ends at the right moment instead of continuing past it into territory that costs more than it gives. And afterward, in the absence of the regret that usually follows your words, you will feel something that does not have a dramatic name, something quiet and steady. The Stoics called it dignity, not the dignity that requires an audience, the kind that only you know you have earned, in the small invisible moments when the choice was yours and you chose well. But this half-second is only the beginning, because silence, real silence, the kind built on something, is not just the absence of a response. It is a specific thing, and to understand what it is, we first have to understand what it is not. This is the part of the conversation that most episodes about silence skip, because it complicates the clean, appealing narrative of silence as always noble, always wise, always the mark of the evolved person. It isn't. And if you treat all silence as though it were the same, if you use the philosophy as a framework for avoidance without examining which kind of silence you are actually practicing, then you are not doing the work. You are doing a more sophisticated version of the same thing you were doing before. So let us be precise. The first kind is the silence of fear. The person who does not speak because they are terrified of what will happen if they do. Terrified of conflict, of judgment, of the vulnerability that comes with saying something true in front of someone who might use it against them. This silence has nothing to do with strength. It is the most common kind of silence there is, and it is built entirely from avoidance. The second is the silence of resentment. The person who goes quiet, not because they have found peace, but because they want to punish. The silent treatment, that specific weaponized withdrawal designed to be felt, to create anxiety, to communicate displeasure without the vulnerability of saying what the displeasure actually is. This is not dignity, it is control wearing restraints clothing. The third is the silence of confusion. The person who says nothing because they genuinely don't know what to say, who is still processing, still working toward a response. This silence is neutral. It is the honest pause of a mind still doing its work. The fourth is where we begin to enter the territory of genuine strength, the silence of discipline. The person who could respond, who has something perfectly targeted to say, who feels the pull of the reaction and chooses deliberately not to follow it, not because the response is absent, but because the wisdom to withhold it is present. This is the silence the Stoics cultivated, the silence of someone who is choosing. The fifth is the silence of rebuilding, the person who withdraws from certain relationships, certain dynamics, certain arenas, not to hide, but to work, to do interior labor that cannot happen in public, to become something that cannot become itself in front of an audience. This is not abandonment, it is investment. And the sixth, the rarest, and the one this entire episode has been moving toward, is the silence of dignity. The person who has genuinely stopped placing their worth in the hands of others to be evaluated, who does not need the verdict, whose quiet is not a strategy, not a wound, not a statement, but simply the natural expression of a self that has found its center. The question the Stoics would ask you is, when you go silent, which of these is it? Not which one you want it to be, which one it actually is. Be honest, because the answer, the real one, is the only place where the work can begin, and the work, it turns out, is less about learning to stay silent and more about understanding what you are actually building when you do. There is a particular kind of person you may have encountered, or may have been at some point, without quite recognizing it at the time. They were present, and then they were not. They were in the middle of things, the group, the social life, the work, the arguments. And then something shifted. They became less available, less visible, less entangled in the dynamics that had previously occupied them. And when you saw them again, months later or a year later, something was different. Not colder, not more distant. Something more like settled, like they had been somewhere and returned from it carrying something they didn't have before. This is the fifth kind of silence, the silence of rebuilding, and it is the one most commonly misread from the outside and most important to understand from the inside. In the Meditations, Marcus Aurelius writes of the soul as the only retreat that is always available, the one that cannot be taken. Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. Not a physical place, not a vacation, the interior of a person, the private, examined, cultivated inner life, as the source of genuine renewal. What happens when someone withdraws into that space? First, they hear themselves again. The constant activity of social life, the presenting, the managing, the performing of whatever the context demands, is loud in a way most people don't notice until it stops. Underneath all of it is a quieter voice, the one that knows what you actually want, what you actually believe, what you actually feel beneath the presentation. In the noise, that voice is drowned. In the silence, it returns, tentatively at first, then with increasing clarity. Second, they stop maintaining fictions. Every social life involves an extraordinary number of small, comfortable lies, positions you haven't examined, relationships you haven't quite ended, commitments made by an earlier version of yourself that no longer fits. Social engagement is remarkably good at keeping those things in place. There is always something else to attend to, some immediate demand that prevents the harder reckoning. Silence removes that buffer. Without it, the fictions become difficult to maintain. You are left with the actual shape of your life and the question of whether it is the one you want. Third, their energy consolidates. All the energy that was leaking into performances, arguments, the maintenance of appearances, suddenly available. And when that energy has nowhere to go but inward, it builds something, slowly, without fanfare, without anyone watching. The person who returns from this kind of withdrawal is not the same person who left. They are quieter, yes, but the quiet is full of the work done in the dark, full of the self that was found when the performance was finally set down. But none of this is visible from the outside, and that invisibility creates a specific problem, one the Stoics thought about carefully, and one that is perhaps the most honest test of whether your silence is what you think it is. There is a strange thing that happens when you stop reacting. The person who expected a reaction, who was waiting for it, who may have been counting on it, does not know what to do. Think about it from the outside. You say something designed to provoke, you wait, the provocation lands, and the person you aimed it at looks at you steadily, says nothing, or says something so measured it gives you nothing to push against, and then continues with what they were doing. What you are left with is something disorienting. Not the satisfaction of having gotten a reaction, not the confirmation that you reached them. Instead, the quiet, uncomfortable realization that you did not reach them, that they are somewhere you cannot access, that the usual mechanisms, provocation, reaction, escalation, have simply not operated. That is what genuine silence does to the balance of power in a moment. It removes leverage, because leverage only works if you are responsive to it, if your state can be altered by what arrives from outside. Seneca wrote in his letters, "Most powerful is he who has himself in his own power." Himself. Not the outcome, not the other people, not whether they understand or approve or respond in the way he needed. The self, governed from within. But here is the nuance most discussions of silence miss entirely. This is not about appearing powerful. It is not a technique for seeming unaffected while being devastated inside. That is not strength. That is performance with better production values. And it is exhausting in exactly the same way as the loudness it replaces. What I am describing becomes available when the work has actually been done. When the silence is real, not performed, not strategic, not maintained through effort. When you genuinely do not need the response. When the image someone else holds of you has been released, actually and not theoretically, from the position of something you need to manage. At that point, the silence is not a tactic, it is a report, a direct and accurate account of the interior state of a person who has found something more important to protect than their reputation. And this, the reality of that silence versus the performance of it, brings us to the question that most honestly tests which one you are actually practicing. A question that is simple to state and very difficult to answer honestly. Can you be misunderstood without rushing to repair the misunderstanding? Not in a case where the misunderstanding has real consequences. Not when something important depends on clarity. I mean the ordinary case. The person who has drawn a conclusion about your motives that isn't quite right. The colleague who thinks you did something for reasons you didn't. The friend who has told a slightly inaccurate story about you to someone else. Can you feel the image shifting in someone else's mind? Feel the familiar pull to correct it, and choose instead to ask, does this actually matter? Does the accuracy of their impression affect anything real? Or am I only uncomfortable because I dislike being wrong in someone's head? If you cannot let it stand, if the discomfort is intolerable regardless of whether anything real is at stake, then the image is still running you, and the silence you perform will always be temporary. A pause before the explanation arrives, not a genuine release from the need for one. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations about the people who speak ill of us, asking himself why their opinion should disturb anything in him. He reminded himself of something precise, that if they knew all his faults, they would have far more to say, which means the partial criticism, the incomplete impression, the wrong conclusion. These can only ambush you if you have been pretending they have no foundation. The person at genuine peace with their own imperfections cannot be wounded by someone pointing at what they already know. And then there is the second test, Harder than the first. Can you send nothing? You receive a message that provokes you. It might be unfair. You write the response carefully, or quickly, it doesn't matter. It says exactly what needs to be said. Your finger hovers. Can you not send it? Not because the response is wrong, but because you ask yourself honestly whether sending it will change anything, whether the person on the other end will receive it the way you intend, whether the satisfaction of having said the right thing is worth what it costs to have said it. Marcus Aurelius returned to one instruction in the Meditations more than almost any other. If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. Not as a rule about honesty alone, as a discipline about motive. Am I speaking because something true needs to be said, or because something in me needs to be heard? Most of the time, hovering over the send button, we already know the answer. The question is whether we are honest enough to act on it. And then there is the third test, the one that is almost impossible to pass without having genuinely done the interior work, the one that reveals, more clearly than anything else, whether what you are practicing is the silence of dignity or the silence of resentment in a more evolved disguise. Can you disappear without hoping they notice your absence? This is the question that separates the philosophy from the performance of the philosophy, because there is a version of disappearing that is not silence at all. It is a statement, a withdrawal designed to be felt, an absence calculated to create anxiety, to communicate something the person is not willing to say with words. It uses the language of the fifth kind of silence, rebuilding, withdrawal, the interior work, while actually operating as the second kind, resentment dressed in more sophisticated clothing. The genuine disappearance, the one that actually builds something, is invisible to its own ego. It is not a message. It is simply the redirection of energy towards something that matters more than whatever dynamic you are leaving behind. And here is how you can tell the difference in yourself. Without pretending, when you go quiet, are you going towards something? Or are you waiting to be noticed for going away? When you stop explaining yourself to a particular person, is it because you genuinely no longer need their understanding? Or is it because you want them to wonder why you stopped? When you withdraw from a conversation or a relationship, is there something on the other side of the withdrawal that you are moving toward? Or is the withdrawal itself the point? These are not comfortable questions. They are not meant to be. They are the questions Epictetus would have asked, the honest self-examination that he considered the foundation of all genuine practice. Not the questions that confirm what you want to believe about yourself, but the questions that reveal what you are actually doing. The Stoics had a word for the gap between who we present ourselves to be and who we actually are in our unobserved choices. They called it the fundamental failure of self-knowledge, and they considered it the source of most human suffering, not circumstances, not other people. The story we tell ourselves about our own motives, uncorrected by honest examination. So before we go further, and we are building towards something in the remaining parts of this episode that will only land if you have answered these questions honestly, I want you to sit with the quietest, most private version of this question. Which kind of silence are you actually practicing? Not which kind you want to practice, not which kind you believe yourself to be capable of, which kind you actually practice in the specific recurring situations of your specific life, because everything that follows depends on the answer being honest. Everything we have discussed so far lives in the abstract until it arrives in the places where it actually costs something. And those places are not the public ones, they are the intimate ones, the relationships where silence is most misunderstood and most needed, and where getting it wrong has the heaviest consequences. In a disagreement with someone you love, not a stranger, not a colleague, but someone whose opinion of you is genuinely important, The pull to speak is enormous. Every silence can feel like abandonment. Every withheld response can feel like indifference. The intimacy creates an expectation of transparency, of constant access to what you are feeling and why. And there is something true in that expectation. Genuine communication, honest, present, clear, is irreplaceable in close relationships. I am not arguing against it, but there is a kind of talking in relationships that is not communication. It is the rehearsed argument designed to win, not to reach understanding. It is the explanation offered not because the other person asked for it, but because your anxiety requires relief. It is the wound that becomes a weapon because you do not yet know what to do with it as a wound. Marcus Aurelius wrote of receiving and releasing, taking what comes without pride, letting go without struggle. In a relationship, this means holding the other person without possessing them, loving fully while retaining enough of yourself, that the love comes from wholeness, not from need. There is a kind of silence in relationships that is the deepest form of respect available. The silence that says, I trust this relationship enough not to feed every small grievance into it. I trust you enough not to make you responsible for every fluctuation of my internal state. That silence is not withholding. It is care. It is the presence of someone who is there because they want to be, not because they need to be. Who can feel something difficult and choose not to make the other person carry it. Who can be in a room with you and simply be there, not performing presence, not managing the relationship, not filling every available space with language. This is the hardest application of everything we have been discussing, and it is the most important one, because the relationships where this silence is most difficult to practice are exactly the relationships where it matters most. And yet, and this is the part I want you to carry into the final stretch of this episode, there is something that all of this, every version of genuine Stoic silence, is building toward, something that only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see the full shape of the practice. Look back at where this episode started. At the beginning, you were holding a draft message, explaining yourself to someone, trying to fix an image, treating the version of you in someone else's mind as though it were yours to manage. And we have traveled a long way from that opening image, through the trap and the loudness it produces, through the half-second where freedom actually lives, through the 6 kinds of silence, the ones that shrink you and the ones that build you, through the rebuilding that happens out of sight, the authority that arrives without announcement, the tests that reveal which silence you are actually practicing. And now we arrive at what all of it has been building toward. Not a technique, not a set of practices to perform, something more fundamental than that. The person who has genuinely traveled this path, who has done the honest work of examining their silence, of distinguishing the real from the performed, of releasing the image without pretending they don't care about it, that person has undergone a specific and irreversible change. They have stopped outsourcing their peace. Not fully, not permanently, not in a way that will never waver under the right kind of pressure, but fundamentally, in the sense that the center of gravity has shifted. The thing that used to feel essential, the understanding of a specific person, the repair of a specific impression, the approval that needed to arrive before they could feel settled, that thing has been quietly relocated, from outside them to inside them. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations that the soul is the only retreat that cannot be taken. Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. He returned to this not as a destination he had reached, but as a direction he was always moving toward, imperfectly, repeatedly, with the full knowledge that the world would keep trying to pull him back toward noise. That is the practice, not achievement, direction. Seneca wrote to Lucilius in letter 101, "Begin at once to live, and count each separate day as a separate life. Not when the conditions are right, not when you have resolved every attachment and cleared every noise. Now, in the ordinary conversations, the provocations, the messages that invite reactions, find the half-second, stay in it long enough to ask the real question. And choose once, just once today, the response that comes from the person you are becoming rather than the anxiety you are trying to manage. Do that enough times, and something changes. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone announces or applauds, but in the way a room changes when someone walks in who is genuinely untroubled, in the way provocations begin to lose their charge, in the way your own voice, when you finally choose to use it, lands differently, because everyone who has been paying attention has felt in the silences that preceded it that this person could speak and chose not to. That is what the strongest people are building when they disappear. Not an image, not a reputation, not the appearance of someone who has mastered themselves. Why do the strongest people disappear in silence? Not because they have nothing left to say, not because they have given up on being understood, not because they are indifferent to the world or the people in it. They disappear because they have finally found something more important than being heard. They have found the version of themselves that exists when no one is watching, the self that does not require an audience to be real, the interior life that is quieter than anything they could produce for public consumption, and more valuable than anything they have ever performed. And when they return, when they speak, when they are present, when they choose to be visible, something is different, not because they have become cold, because they have become free. Until next time, be the silence.